Yes, okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Stephanie, in particular, for making this night possible. You did a really great job. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new ones to bring the semester to close together. I'm Lexa, as some people might remember. And tonight I will help guide you through different facets of fashion. Because regardless of whether we see fashion as personal, cultural, or political, with aversion or with admiration, it still speaks for us in more ways than we can imagine. It is undoubtedly a system of language and something that contains artistic and theoretical multitudes. It's also a way to visualize delusion theories without using drugs, so that's a nice one. Now with Deleuze freshly mentioned, I would love to introduce you to the woman at the forefront of the fashion theories minor, coordinator and lecturer, Rebecca Brewer.
Thank you, Lexa. And dear public, thank you for joining this evening, organized by the students. Once again, thank you, Stephanie, from the Amsterdam Fashion Institute, and more particularly the Minor Fashion Theories Honours Programme. This is a program that runs in 20 weeks between February and July every year, and about 20 students participate in it. As Lexa said, I'm the coordinator and also a lecturer in the Minor Fashion Theories, as are Kim Bruggeman and Caroline Hanke here on the second row. So during these 20 weeks, students and lecturers together dive deeply into fashion and the many underlying theories that help open up a profound insight into what we can really say about what underlies fashion. We do not discuss trends, clothing that much, or catwalks per se, but deploy several theories from anthropology, cultural studies, cultural philosophy, and marketing theories to gain insights into the complex mechanisms at work in the meaning, history, and communication of what we wear. Some names, and I have to look at my notes here: Richard Sennett, Nicholas Meershoff, Marcel Mauss, Marshall McLuhan, Michel Foucault, Jean Baudrillard, John Story, Edward Said, Judith Butler, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, Stephen Brown, Fuwa Fira and Ron Elliott are only some of the theorists that these students now know about and can use to make more sense of the complex field that encompasses the word fashion. But, as said, this is an evening by and for students and anyone else interested in fashion beyond superficiality. Please enjoy and do not hesitate to ask any questions during the Q&A or afterwards. The floor is to my wonderful students.
Okay, so first up we'll be hearing from Julia, who, with an interest in fashion and marketing, and also discovered a preference in pants colors among men, wrote a paper on cultural codification that she will tell you more about. Hello?
Yeah. All right. So to start off, my paper is about to what extent color preferences are, predetermined for Western male consumers, and to what extent they're culturally codified. And so to start off, what got me into this is, I used to work in a men's pants store, which it has 11 types of pants, I think over 55 colors, and every time I was helping out someone, or like a Western male customer, they would always opt for the dark blue. And I was always like, we have 55 colors, and you're going for the dark blue. Like, why is that? Which led me to my research paper. And what I really realized was, well, color affects our day-to-day life. It affects our purchasing decisions, thence the marketing. And understanding the relationship between tones and color preferences is vital for the fashion industry as well. We have designers, we have merchandisers, and these simple colors can make a huge importance in the outcome of your collection. So visual keys, yeah, what I was saying are really important when you're gonna make a purchase. And this paper is really concerned with what happened in history that led men to start buying dark blue pants. And it starts off, briefly stated, it starts off with the French Revolution, where initially you had men dress up with wigs, with heels, flamboyant colors, extravagant silhouettes. And after the French Revolution, you have the Great Male Renunciation, where where Western men left all of this behind, opting for darker hues, more like practical silhouettes, or yeah, more like standard forms, what we see more nowadays as well. And then later on we get, after World War II, the symbol of blue is for boys and pink is for girls. And so I follow the scheme of how that happens in history and how it's come to look today. Yeah.
Thank you. And was it clear from the start that culture also played a role in this preference, or did you find that out later during the research?
That's a good question. Well, I'm half Dutch and half Iranian, and I noticed more that just from my personal experience, that Dutch men love the color dark blue, whereas in Iran, when I go there, men wear more colorful things, also different fabrics and materials. And I think that history plays a great role with that. In the past in Iran, well, mostly under the monarchy, you had, in the Persian army, you had men wear heels, you had many different colors. It's just part of the culture. I do have to say I've dived mostly into the Western male consumer culture, and that's where I really saw the dark blue and the dark colors come through.
And in your paper, you also mentioned that people generally prefer cool colors over warm colors. How would you explain that preference? And is it only the case for men or all genders?
I found out there were quite a few studies that showed this, and one was about fashion and another was particular for household items, and that color symbolize, people refer color with similar things. So, well, with household items, I guess it's quite easy that yellow, lemon, clean. So blue seemed that, sorry, I had a little mind blank, that with blue and darker tones, they're more cooler, they're more logical, and this is also seen with the Great Male Renunciation, and that warmer tones, so pinks, warmer hues, they're more emotional. And yeah, so they reference that in the Great Enlightenment. They reference that in multiple studies with around 200 people as well.
And you just mentioned history in the explanation. But how would you say that the color codification for men has evolved over the years?
So what I mentioned earlier was, well, prior to the French Revolution, that men were wearing wigs, they were wearing heels. It was quite flamboyant and quite, well dressed. And after the French Revolution, because I'm focusing on males in the West, it was, it wasn't done. Men left this behind. They focused on the simplified silhouette. And then over time, prior to World War I, starting off with children, they mostly wore white because it was easy to bleach. There wasn't necessarily that idea of gendered clothing or clothing based on sex. And so only really after World War I, we had the idea of coming actually from the US, from department stores, as a marketing strategy, that blue was seen as more soft, more relaxing, and pink being quite a harsh tone. And so they're more of a dominant tone, sorry. And so it was that blue was for girls and pink was for boys. But then we see after World War II, where it kind of reverses. And in World War II, under the Nazis, the Nazis had to, or made members of the LGBTQ wear a pink badge, meaning that if you were gay, you had to wear the pink badge and then therefore be separated in the crowd. And so after World War II, it was seen as pink being for girls because it was more of a feminine color. It wasn't seen as a very powerful color. However, in the 60s and the 70s, pink regained its power as LGBTQ plus rights progressed. So that slowly came into pink being for girls and blue being for boys. So kind of that opposite.
And I might have broken something. Let's not focus on that. With an increase in freedom of self-expression and fluidity in gender, do you think men's preferences and societal codifications for colors are changing or might change in the near future?
Oh, well, from my personal experience, I think for sure. Already just working in a men's pants store, you notice that the younger audience is slowly opting for more pastel colors. You don't necessarily see that idea as pink being for girls and blue being for boys. And I think one of the main reasons that is well, you have so many trends going on and so fast, but also you have pop stars and idols. Well, starting off with David Bowie, you have Prince. I mean, nowadays you have Harry Styles. It's slowly, because consumers are becoming more aware of this, they're less focused on, oh, this is girly and this is, this is more feminine, this is more masculine. And so they're kind of going away from this. And like skirts are regaining their power. Pink is no longer seen as girly.
Thank you. Very clear. And then we will move on to Mace, who dove into theories of objection and the body due to her passion for film and horror.
Yes. So I initially got an interest in the topic of horror and fashion because I saw that a lot of designers, like Alexander McQueen, obviously makes these really grotesque designs, but also Vivienne Westwood and Comme des Garçons, but also more common brands like Prada and Gucci are doing like horror-inspired shows. So I was like, why is horror such a sort of continual, like, fertile ground for fashion designers? Why are they so perpetually inspired by it? So why are we sort of drawn in, but at the same time repulsed, and we're also captivated by our own horror and our own lack of understanding of these kind of grotesque garments? That led me to the theory of objection by psychoanalyst and philosopher Julia Kristeva, and I also combined that with the anthropologist Mary Douglas's theory of dirt is matter out of place. And then one of the first essays we read, actually the first class for one of our first classes for the body department, because one of the courses is about fashion and the body, was about Martha Nussbaum's essay on was called On Not Hating the Body, and that was the first essay that kind of the first text that we read for fashion theories, and it was also the one that instantly inspired me, so that I also used for this paper. That's basically what I talk about throughout the thing.
Great. And where do you personally think the fascination with body horror in fashion comes from?
This was a really central question that I started out with when I was starting the research. And it led me to the theory of objection. Julia Kristeva writes about this in her book, The Powers of Horror, an essay on objection. And to her, objection is the reaction of horror that we get when we're confronted with something that we can't quite distinguish as being either self or other, so either like subject or object, and that causes meaning to implode. And it sounds pretty abstract right now, but I will try to explain it. Something abject is, for example, a corpse, because it confronts us with our own materiality and our own sort of inevitable decay. We want to reject the thoughts when we see of our inevitable decay when we see a corpse, but we can never really truly part from the thought. And also bodily fluids. They were once inside us and now are outside us. So they are neither self nor other. And they're in this sort of ambiguous state, and they shatter our comprehension of our own sort of bodily borders. And this confrontation with the abject is really similar to Lacan's idea of the confrontation with the real. Basically, according to Lacan, once we enter into language, we accept the sort of rules and meanings that are dictated by society, which is called the symbolic order. And the real is a sort of pre-symbolic order that we experience before we entered language. And after we've entered language, we can never return to the real. We don't have the vocabulary and the understanding to return to it. And yeah, so the symbolic order is basically anything we can ascribe meaning to. And in Krsteva's writing, the symbolic order is really tied to the body and its borders. So she writes that once we enter sort of, or we go through the mirror phase, once we acknowledge we're a separate entity from our mother, we can distinguish self and other. We have an idea that we have our own body and our mother has another body. And so from then on, we can distinguish self and other. And from then on, we can experience also the feeling of abjection, which is when we see something that transgresses that idea of self and other. And that causes sort of this meaning to implode. And when we have an implosion of meaning, which we have at the site of body horror fashion, so this fashion where there's like kind of tears in the body or this blood splattered or this kind of grotesque thing where there's like these bodily fluids or a body looks like a corpse, which are examples of the abject, then we get this kind of horror feeling and we're kind of confused about why we can't stop looking at it, because it's something that draws us in, because we don't understand it, because it kind of breaks down meaning. And so an example I give in the paper is, for example, the like very typical Lady Gaga's meat dress. It's like it's kind of unclear where her body starts and the body of the animal meat begins. So her bodily borders are sort of blurring beyond comprehension, and we're not quite sure why it disturbs us so much. So basically what draws us to horror fashion is our lack of understanding of it, is my answer I would give.
Very clear. And you also compare Krsteva's objection to Mary Douglas's idea on dirt being matter out of place. Mm-hmm. What do you think the similarities are?
Yeah, well, Mary Douglas writes kind of about, in her book, like Purity and Danger, it's called, she writes about purity and impurity as social constructs. So then she arrives at the idea that dirt is matter out of place. She writes that where there's dirt, there's system. So dirt cannot be specified as a lack of hygiene per se. It's more when something becomes dirt, when it's no longer placed where it belongs within these classifications imposed by society. So for example, if we have a sock that's in our drawer, we don't necessarily consider it dirty. It's where it's supposed to be. But once we put it on a table or on the top of a coffee machine or in the fridge, we'd be like, get that out of here, like I don't want to see that, or then it becomes dirty. But nothing about this object has changed. There's like it's not inherently unhygienic or dirty. It becomes dirty because it's out of place. So its dirtiness is dictated by its out-of-placeness, and it has disturbed our sense of order. And Krsteva also writes, I have like an actual quote here from her, it is thus not the lack of cleanliness or health that causes abjection, but what disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules, the in-between, the ambiguous, and the composite. So both of these theories state that dirt or like something abject is not necessarily a lack of cleanliness, but it is sort of disturbance of order and the erasure of borders and like the rupture of our understanding. So it betrays the symbolic order, and that causes a reaction of disgust and misunderstanding. That's why they're similar.
And you also give the brand Lemaine as an example with their flesh clothing of horror in fashion. How do you think designer Lina M. Ain, am I saying that right, Lina? Okay. Brings body horror as art and body horror as a political disruption together in their designs.
Yeah, so the designs of, I think it's pronounced Lamania, but that's not how you write it at all, so it's really weird. But so this brand, all the clothes kind of look like torn flesh or like decaying flesh, and there's blood spread all over the body. It's really kind of grotesque and disturbing to see. And if you read an interview with the designer, they state that their aim is to create disruptive fashion that defies the status quo. So I was like, okay, how does your fashion defy the status quo? And by seeing it by interpreting their designs as something that is abject, or as an example of the abject, I could kind of get to an idea of like, how does it actually disturb or defy the status quo? Well, the designs really embrace bodily gore. It's almost as if someone like has a cut and then spreads the blood all over it. Like it's really reveling in this grime and gore and bodily fluids. And as I've said before, Kristiva writes that bodily fluids are something abject because they used to be inside us and are now outside us. So you can no longer distinguish them as being either self or other. And they also kind of confront us with our own inevitable decay, which is a thought we want to reject, but we can't really part from. So it's either self or other again. And also, the clothes kind of disrupt our idea of what clothing are supposed to be. So it's not fabric that's covering the body, but it's covering the body with something that looks even more like flesh or like the body itself. So it kind of disrupts our idea of the function of clothing. So yeah, Lamania, or Lamania, it's written Lamaine, but Lamania kind of challenges these social boundaries by creating this kind of abject body horror fashion, and that compels us to examine our own kind of repulsed reaction and question our notion of filth.
And with how like self-expression in fashion has kind of become a lot more open and a lot more out of the box now. Do you think of like, for example, Lamania's flash fashion, is that still just like art, or do you think it's also something that's wearable, kind of, if that makes sense?
Mostly because what I've seen on their Instagram, their clothes kind of get used for music videos, like Charli XCX had an outfit on, and I also saw recently Julia Fox on some magazine cover with wearing also one of these designs. So far it's more like famous people or people who are like known for being a bit more like avant-garde or something. But yeah, I think also there are people who like wear it out to party and stuff. So I think it's becoming more and more popular, and I see a lot of on TikTok also. I scroll, maybe that's because I'm in the algorithm that promotes it, obviously. But yeah, I think it's definitely blowing up. So it could become a trend, definitely. It's not yet, but it is gaining more popularity.
Interesting. And then later you also write about Martha Nussbaum and about embracing the body and kind of our disgust with it. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is? Like, why should we embrace?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's an essay by Martha Nussbaum, and which is called On Not Hating the Body. And she kind of calls on us to overcome our hatred of our own bodies. She writes about different philosophical movements, or like different philosophical ways of looking at the body and the soul. And it used to be that, or it maybe still is, that we saw like the body is often described as a prison for the soul, or the body is something that needs to be transcended, like within Christianity. It's something, the body is something that's trivial. They kind of put forward the idea that the soul is something that lives on after we die, but the body just decays, and it's trivial because of that. But Nussbaum sort of argues that we shouldn't really do that. I'll get to that. But the reason I also applied Nussbaum is because there's a bit of overlap between what she says and also the writings of Julia Kristiva, because Nussbaum sort of argues that we regard our bodies and our bodily fluids with a lot of disgust because it confronts us with our decay. Like I said, the body is often seen traditionally as something that just decays, whereas the soul kind of lives on. And Kristiva also writes that we expel our bodily fluids in order to live, so confronting them, it's like confronting our own death. So that's a sort of overlap. And then also she writes that the celebration of our bodily fluids can be something that's very politically disruptive. She gives the example of feminists often celebrating women's bodily fluids, like promoting or going against the idea that that women's bodies are sort of impure or disgusting, so it can be a sort of political movement. And Julia Kristeva also writes that the sort of transgression of written and unwritten laws of society can also be a form of abjection. So abjection can literally be a sort of protest against these rigid cultural standards. So that's where the overlap is. And yeah, Nussbaum kind of arrives at this point of that we should kind of embrace our fluids and really look at them, really search out this confrontation, like get a colonoscopy in order to really see them and kind of overcome this fear of our own bodies and, let me see, and kind of stop this repulsion against our own bodies. So yeah, that's it.
And at the end of the paper, you propose the question, how can body horror fashion be used to acquaint ourselves with our bodies in order to disrupt notions of bodily filth and challenge our repulsion to our bodies? Do you yourself have an idea of how this can be done?
Yeah, so basically, I kind of start off with Nussbaum here, and she, like I said, she really calls on us to purposefully look out our fluids and our bodies and really embrace it. And I think that because we kind of experience horror at the sight of these vulgar, what we think as vulgar things that, or like at the sight of things that cross the boundaries of social classifications, that like lie outside the symbolic order and that break down the assigned meanings within the symbolic order, like being confronted with our fleshiness and like our bodily gore can kind of compel us to examine the lack of understanding that it brings up in us, and be confronted with that collapse of meaning, and maybe even challenge our own repulsion to our own bodies and to kind of disrupt these notions of bodily filth, and yeah, challenge and reconsider the classifications that dictate when something is seen as out of place or dirty. So I think if this body horror fashion becomes a trend, if it really blows up, I think we could potentially like kind of start to get more acquainted with our bodies, or it be an example for us to be more inspired by it. Like, for example, if garments that I've seen these garments that don't really that look like veins over someone's body, or like these, like it's almost like as if what's usually inside of us is now a garment outside of us, so they look like these vein patterns. And that's also sort of maybe would spark an interest in how our body works. And I also think it's pretty disruptive to see a society where we have clothes usually are here to disguise our bodies, but now our bodies are like, what's inside is outside. I don't know how to say it properly, but I think that if it really becomes a trend and if it really sort of blows up and we see a lot of kind of fashion inspired by bodily gore, I think that will really sort of could really confront us with these things that we're sort of repulsed by, and maybe question our repulsion to them and maybe stop hating the body in some way. But yeah, I'm not really sure because it's not really a trend yet, but I think that if it would become, it would be really interesting to examine if that would work, yeah.
Yeah, that would be really cool indeed. Anyone in the audience have any questions for Mace or Julia, or anything that they've noticed themselves in changes in color codification in Western men, or in their relationship to the body and bodily gore? Yes, I think you're going to get a mic. Yes.
Yes? Yeah, thank you. I was wondering about the body of horror. You're giving us example of McQueen, but he also has like a more abstract way of giving the body of horror. What do you think about that? Because he gives very like literal ways about the body of horror, but like why are people repulsed by some abstract ways of horror?
Yeah, the example I give in the paper is something that's very centered on bodily fluids, which really connects to Julia Kristeva's idea of bodily fluids being abject. I don't really have an example of Alexander McQueen in the paper. I'm sure that there are some interpretations of his stuff as abject. I do know the one where that's the woman who's like with all the moths and stuff. I do think that could be seen as an example of the abject because it's sort of a living kind of corpse idea, which the corpse is also something that's abject because it confronts us with our own sort of materiality. So yeah, I think that could be, for example, seen. It's a bit less literal than the ones with covered in bodily fluids, but yeah, that's the immediate thing that comes to mind. But I think he's also done garments where it looks like blood is spattered over people. So
also like the abstract way. Why, of course, repulsed by the abstract way of the body of horror. What do you think?
Let me think.
Is it like a connotation they have like with the colors and like the scheme they see? Like is it like everything together? Or?
I don't think I really understand your question right now.
Like what I mean was like because like special blood is like very little way of the bodily fluids, but like more the abstract way of horror, like what they show in like some collections, like you mentioned too. Like why are people repulsed also by that? Like the meat dress too, like it's not really a literal way of like the human body.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a sort of the abject is really a sort of transgression between this between the self and the other. So the meat dress is really something that you don't really know where her body starts and the meat begins. So that kind of blurs these bodily borders, and that's what causes abjection. So that's why it's an example. But I can't, like, if you would give me a few Alexander McQueen like runway things, you could probably argue for a lot of them why they are abject. But I don't think you can call a lot of them necessarily. I don't know if you can call every single one of them an example of abjection, but I think you can with certain ones. But yeah, also the fact that it's so grotesque in general can be something that's very disruptive, of course, because that's also what Kristiva writes, like something that's like grotesque and makes us question what we consider as dirty. Just the fact that we're repulsed by something already can tell us that it's kind of outside our comfort zone and outside, of what we can ascribe this meaning to. So I think that any fashion designer that sort of evokes this uncomfortable feeling in us is really worthy of examining. Maybe not with the specific theory, but maybe other horror theories. But yeah, I think it's mostly about, I mean, shock is always this strong emotion within his particular designs. So, I think also not literally bodily fluids, but just the shock that it invokes in us. I think you could argue that it's abject because it kind of makes us question why we're uncomfortable with it, I guess.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Any more questions or comments?
Ask a question? I was actually wondering about your subject, if in any way or form your view on your own body changed while writing the paper.
That's really, really interesting. It's been a while since I've written the paper, but I definitely, when I first was looking at a lot of the images that I was using in the paper, I was kind of didn't want to look at them. And at some point I got more and more used to it, which is also why I think that if it does become a trend, we can actually grow more familiar with these bodily fluids and start sort of accepting our bodies and not hating them, because I started becoming less and less repulsed by seeing all these fluids, and I think it also made me reconsider my own body. I was definitely, while I was writing the paper, every time I thought something was gross or dirty, I was definitely like, no, this isn't really inherently gross or dirty. That's just my perception or my idea of where something should reside, or yeah, it made me definitely question why that initial reaction is of repulsion, while it's actually mostly just because I feel like it's out of place. So yeah, it made me, at the moment, while I was writing it, I was definitely, with everything, reconsidering, like, oh, every time I felt disgust, I was definitely questioning my reaction to it.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're there. So let's go.
Okay, sorry for the other person. Sorry. I have kind of like a mixture of a question for Mace, but inspired by Julia. What do you think is needed, because it's very much about shock and the spectacle and horror, what is needed to maybe that it becomes a fashion trend, the gore, that we accept it as beautiful? And I'm inspired by Julia because you tell the story of the pink was for boys and then blue was for boys. So like what kind of shift in our mindsets is needed that we can actually see it as something that is beautiful, and hopefully also then that has to do with that we find our bodies beautiful, if you get what I mean. So as a celebration of the body.
Yeah, I think it probably will depend on the design. I think I definitely know that I started to when I was writing the paper, I started to grow I grew finding. Wait, how do you say this? I started to like the garments and started to consider them as beautiful. Whereas first I thought they were a bit terrifying. I don't know. I think it maybe is a sort of slow, sort of gradual change, because the silhouettes of these garments that I was of the brand that I took as an example, they're very nice silhouettes. They're like a party dress silhouette or like a corset silhouette. So it's these kind of silhouettes that we're already used to, but then applied with something different. So I think that would be like a starting phase. And I also looked at some designs where there's actually really interesting, these beautiful vein patterns. I don't really know if there's I think it's probably like a gradual change. I think often with trends, like when we first see something, or like maybe with tabby boots or something, where what is this? Yeah. And then slowly we're like, oh, this is actually so beautiful. Yeah. When I first see a trend, I can actually be like, oh, what is that? And then when slowly it becomes a trend, obviously we start thinking it's more beautiful because then more people start doing it, and it becomes, more sort of accepted. It sort of blends in, I guess. Well, maybe then it becomes not as disruptive as it once was, but that's always with trends,
Yeah. And sometimes, in the avant-garde shocks, and then it becomes like a trend you see in the streets. I was just wondering, can we expect meat dresses in the Kalverstraat? If you, and what do you think?
I don't really know. I think obviously with trends, things often start as something that's really shocking or different, and then it gets really assimilated into the culture. I don't know, with meat dresses might be hard because meat can go bad really fast, but something that looks like meat, I think it could become like a real trend. I really think that this is really gaining popularity, like the Lemania brand, especially with a lot of pop stars wearing it in their music videos. It's kind of becoming more popular. So maybe in 10 years it becomes popular, and then we'll think nothing of it after a few months because of the fast trend cycle.
Thanks for that. Just an additional question for Julia. You said that when during the 1930s the Nazis assigned pink as a weak color, that caused a change for pink being for gays and girls. If you translate that idea to horror dressing, what is needed in society? Is that something in horror films, or in accepting, or a blockbuster, or can you imagine? And this is not, we cannot pinpoint you on it, but can you imagine anything that will change the object becoming beautiful?
Is it? Yeah. Okay. So I would say I think that initially it's having a group of people being kind of focused as the others. And so, yeah, maybe similar to body horror, although I have to say my knowledge in horror movies is horrible. And I would say that, for example, for the LGBT community after World War II, it's regaining that power, and also with other people, seeing that familiarity in, yeah, for example, those colors. And I think, at least with color trends now, the more you're familiar with the color, the more you perceive it, the more, for example, with toys for kids growing up, that you have, yeah, you don't have that color codification. The more you're familiar with that growing up, the more you're willing to accept it. And so I'm not really sure if this answers your question, but I think that this is why pink has kind of regained its power and is also being pushed for all genders.
Okay, I have a question for both, and I start with a question for Julia. My question, I was fascinated by the idea that you said, okay, I expect that colors will become more fashionable because I see a lot of young people coming in and they buy all kind of colors. So the obvious question is, what will happen when those young guys grow older? Will they then return back to blue? Or will they stick to their colors? Because, well, I look at myself, I'm an old guy, so I don't wear a pink dress anymore, or a pink...
Yeah, you're trying to get ahead of the game, so later you're like, okay, I have all the colors that are coming in trend. No, I would say that, well, now how things are going on, I'm not just talking about fashion, I'm talking about movies, media, celebrities, pushing, for men's pants stores, pushing all colors for Western males. I would say that in the future you could have colors form into trends. I don't think that'll ever leave, but I think that the association of color to a sex, that'll slowly die out, because the color itself doesn't necessarily have a meaning. When you look at the color blue, nothing about the color blue literally has anything to do with men. It's the association we have with it. So I think that over time, I mean, you'll have, for example, red will be in the autumn winter of 2025, I don't know, but you won't necessarily have that gendered meaning or that association to a sex. That's how I would see it.
Okay. Then I also have a question for Mace. I was mainly fascinated by your idea, by your story about the socks, and that something is dirty and something is repulsive. And I was wondering whether horror clothes are actually not more linked to females than to men. And then you could see it as a statement where they want to show that where they were rejected because of their bodily fluid, all of a sudden becomes a real statement of femininity.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I actually, when I was writing the paper, I asked my teacher, like, should I do it more focusing on women's bodies? Because women's bodies are often seen as they have to be kept more pure within our society, or like, or women's bodies are often seen as impure and they need to be clean. And I think on women's bodies, there's a lot more limits placed and a lot more restrictions, and we have to sort of keep up our appearance. We cannot be gross, we cannot be dirty, we cannot, we cannot talk about our fluids, we cannot talk about our periods, that's something we do not discuss. So I think maybe with women, it would make even more of a statement than with men, because men are often not as restricted in how gross they can be or how gross they are allowed to be. So I think maybe for women it would be a bit more powerful to kind of celebrate their blood. It can be a statement on periods and celebrating periods, not to necessarily say that only women have periods, but like just traditionally the way it's looked at also. I think Yeah, I think right now maybe it would be a more powerful statement for women, I think, maybe. In the paper I kept it more to in general, but I do see where your question comes from. And yeah, I think there's also an example that Nussbaum, for example, uses in her essay. She uses also an example of feminists celebrating bodily fluids as a sort of statement against the patriarchy. So yeah, it definitely has some overlap. It makes sense.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? No? Okay, cool. So then last but certainly not least, Nicole Spakman, whose critical take on fashion led her to analyzing the bad and the ugly of the fashion industry and attempting to reform it herself with her very own graduation project. So I will now give you this theme.
So hi guys, my name is Nicole, and I am actually a last year student from the minor. So I did my graduation this January, and I did the minor the year before that. So my presentation will not be about anything that I have written during the minor, but actually the period after that. And with that, I actually want to show how I incorporated what I have learned during the minor in my design practice. So I am, of course, going to start with the theory, which basically starts with my personal experience of fashion, which starts with this very lovely baby picture of me. Maybe you are already wondering why you are seeing blauwe muisjes and a blue little suit that I'm wearing. It's because my mom didn't give a shit. She loved the color blue, and that's why I'm wearing blue. I'm wearing blue in basically all my pictures from the first maybe 4 years of my life, because she just hated the color pink. But gradually over the course of my life, I noticed that because of the people surrounding me, the way I was brought up, kind of this perspective of not giving a fuck about what you're wearing changed. And so when I was in high school, I totally changed my way of dressing. I was not really much myself anymore, but I was basically a copy of the people around me. As you can see here, your typical Barbie doll face. Yeah, so let's leave it at that. And now from this insight, we will go into the start of my project and the theory that I've written into, which is the construction of gender within the fashion industry. And so what I've studied was at first the origin of the construction, and what I've learned within my studies was actually that it originated in the etiquettes of the Victorian age, but it actually flourished during the Industrial Revolution. And this was mainly because the middle and higher classes of society went to work, or well, the men went to work and the women stayed home. And the women were kind of this performance or display of status in their way of dressing. So with this Industrial Revolution, we kind of formed this split of the men are here at work and the women are at home. Of course, in the higher places of society, because the lower bottom of society had to work, all of them had to work. And with that, they kind of wanted the woman to dress nicely and show the status of the partner. And kind of this split between genders moved on, and it quickly became the norm when we move way forward, of course, in time, to people following the split in gender norms. And because people were following this split, it actually fueled this standard. Because people were following, the industry was like, hey, people are catching up to this, so we're doing something good. People are buying stuff, so we need to do this more. And this kind of created this vicious cycle of we're just going to continue in this split that we have created, so as I said, it created the split, or as I would like to call it, a duplication within the production system. So we do not see the regular white t-shirt anymore, but we see the pink t-shirt and the blue t-shirt. And with that, we have the consequence of more production, and with that, the consequence of more waste. So that was kind of the material effects that I have been studying in my research for my graduation project. But in my personal experience as a queer person, I also discovered in the gender construct there are some, mental effects. And one of that is that the LGBTQ community is actually kind of feeling that they are pushed inside a box that they do not really fit into. And they find it hard to explore their connection to queerness. So this was also another effect that kind of came up during my research and also during my personal experience of living on this earth ball. So that all brought me to this little research conclusion, which is that the consequences that I have found within my research led me to queer ecofeminism, meaning that I started to view the problems through a non-dualistic lens. So in my design practice, I don't want to see gender construction and fabric waste as two separate problems within one system, but rather tied together in one vicious circle, keeping the same state of living alive. So then we move on to my concept and design. So with this in the back of my mind, I wanted to create a label which kind of tackled this whole conclusion in one bit. So not one problem at once, but kind of seeing it as a whole and working with that as a whole. So I created Reckon the Label, which is a sustainable clothing label that creates modular suits, but from repurposed materials. And the design of the suit is made in a way that the wearer can explore their own style within one uniform. So here you can see the suit. On this image you see one and the same suit, but worn in many different ways. And so the idea of the suit is that you can change it in any way that you would like to. And with that, I wanted to create a modern shape, something that has become timeless. And with that, elongate the lifetime of the fabric, and actually elongate it even longer because it already had a life before it became this suit. And besides that, it also has a different effect because of the changing of styles. It can kind of shape the wearer's form rather than it shapes the wearer. So it doesn't really matter who wears it. The suit always forms to the person who is wearing the suit. It always kind of copies the character of the person within the suit because he creates his own, they create their own style with it. And then, as I already kind of mentioned briefly, the suit is made from repurposed material, and the design is made in a zero waste way so that all the material is being reused and nothing goes to waste. And for this particular suit, I used curtains, and because of the changing size of the curtains, I had to come up with a construction to make sure that even if the size changes, I can still use up all the material. So what I did was I came up with 3 what I call add-ons, and these are 3 objects that you can put within the suit depending on how big the size of the fabric is. So if the fabric is quite large, you can have all the add-ons, but if it's not, you can have just the pants and the jacket, or 1 or 2 add-ons with it. And then, as a last final detail, the suit has been made from a curtain in this particular design to actually highlight kind of the research again, where I wanted to the fabric to be like a barrier where the person can kind of be itself. It kind of acts as this savior place, because normally curtains in a home is something where you cover up the household space and where you can then feel safe and be yourself, because the outside world can no longer look into the house. So this was another symbolic reference into the design. And that was kind of my story. So now I wanted to go back into the theory, but then bring the question to you, because I'm quite wondering, in what way or form do you think that the gender construct impacted your way of dressing throughout your life or at the moment? Anyone?
Well, I can tell about myself that I was always very compressed by the gender norms in the beginning, but now actually going to mates again, it's like, and now I like almost to be repulsed by people by the way I'm dressed, because it's like almost like a protest in that way, and I really like the beauty of the grotesque, or what people are maybe grossed out by, like the queerness or the feminization of men fashion. And that really helped me to also express myself in that way. But it's more, I feel very comfortable in it, but also a protest and almost not feeling comfortable with myself just to get the message out. So that's how it's like impacted me in that way.
Yeah, I can totally understand. I think I had the same struggle with always weighing, do I want to kind of show, or do I want to feel safe in this space where I'm going? It's always weighing what is more valuable to me at that moment in time.
It's a very big thing in queerness itself too.
Yeah.
I think everybody in the queer community has this issue or like this question for themselves. I really think it's like a general question.
Yeah, definitely.
I could maybe answer that as well. So whenever I go to Iran, I also wear a headscarf, and sometimes it just falls off, and then I get told like, oh, would you please place it back on? And yeah, wearing that then out in public, it feels sometimes, yeah, it's not necessarily something I would necessarily think about. So then when I'm back here, yeah, that gender construct of how you wear your hair doesn't really take place here. So it's quite interesting to see, yeah, kind of the gender construct in your clothing and apparel, for example, in the Netherlands versus Iran, but just like different countries as well.
Yeah, I even feel like maybe here it's the opposite. If you would wear the headscarf, you would get even more looks than if you wouldn't here.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
thanks for sharing, Julia. Much appreciated. Yeah, I realized that I have difficulty oftentimes buying clothes because I'm a bit taller than the average woman, and that actually I found out a few years ago that I'm actually the average man size. So someone advised me to go shopping in the men's section. But yeah, you know, there's of course body sizes and length and tallness and differences that do not comply with a standard. And I guess in that sense, it's not so much a question, but a remark that genders are also standards. You know, you're not supposed to have shoe size over that when you're a woman, or be taller, or have longer arms, or be bigger, or so that. Yeah, and I think, and that's a compliment. I think maybe you should step aside from the pedestal, that we can see that actually your pants are adjustable, and you know, you can do something with that.
Thank you for sharing. By the way, I think length is, because I'm very much the average height of a woman, is definitely nothing that I have thought about before. So thank you for that insight.
It's not that easy.
Maybe we can move on to questions, if anyone has any. Or remarks. All hands in the air. Okay, in that case.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Actually, one question, because like with the designs you have now, it's like all, you know, you can kind of fit it to yourself. It's like very adjustable. Do you think in the future with your label you also want to look at silhouettes that are more fixed, and a way to have like more fixed silhouettes that are yeah, pretty gender fluid?
Yeah, actually, my plan in the future would be to design with other queer people, because this particular suit is designed by myself, and I'm just one few within the queer community. So in future collections, I really hope to collaborate with other perspectives, and that could maybe influence the fluidity of the suit. But I still think that the adjustability will be one of the core concepts within the design.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, in that case, thank you all for listening.
Okay, and that was our last speaker. So I just want to thank all our amazing speakers for presenting their work here tonight, and thank the audience again for coming. And yeah, I think that's a wrap on all of this. So yeah, have a great evening still. And yeah.